Hi everyone, my name is Sarah Mari. I'm one of the librarians at Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine, and I'm here today with another picture book about Black history. Today's a little different than some of the other books that we have been reading because it's not exactly a biography. Lillian in this book was inspired by a real person, Lillian Allen, but rather than being her story exactly, it's more a story about voting and the importance of the right to vote and how Black people were able to gain the right to vote, as well as the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So let's dive in with Lillian's Right to Vote, a celebration of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, written by Jonah Winter and illustrated by Shane W. Evans. This book is published by CSchwartz Wade Books. A very old woman stands at the bottom of a very steep hill. It's voting day. She's an American, and by God, she's going to vote. Lillian is her name. It's a long haul up that steep hill. It's a long haul when you've been alive for 100 years. It's a long haul when you've lived the life that Lillian has, and walked so far in her shoes. When Lillian looks up, it's more than a blue sky she sees. She sees history. Lillian sees her great-great-grandparents, Elijah and Sarah. They are standing side by side on an auction block. Sarah is holding their baby, Edmund. They are being sold as slaves in front of the very same Alabama courthouse where rich white men and no one else was allowed to vote. Lillian starts her slow climb. Though the sun shines brightly, Lillian sees a dark time from years long past. She sees her great-grandpa, Edmund, now grown. He is owned by another man, forced to pick cotton from daybreak to nightfall, right here in this country, where it is written that all men are created equal. He sure doesn't have the right to vote. In fact, he doesn't have the right to do much at all until after the Civil War, which will end slavery. As Lillian inches up the hill past one neighbor's house, and then the next, she sees her great-grandpa Edmund on his way to vote for the first time, thanks to a law that was passed in 1870. The law is the 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which states that American citizens' right to vote shall not be denied or abridged on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Even though the law does not allow women to vote, Great-Grandma Ida is with her husband. Lillian feels their dignity and their pride as they enter that courthouse for the first time. But as Lillian continues and the hill gets steeper, that hill is steep, she sees what happens just 20 years later. Right here in Alabama, there's her grandpa Isaac at the courthouse being charged a poll tax to vote, a tax that he doesn't have the money to pay. So much for that 15th Amendment. So much for Grandpa Isaac's right to vote. Lillian pauses to catch her breath, hearing now the voice of her uncle, Levi. He's telling her about those tests that he was forced to take when he tried to vote, and about the sneer on the registrar's face when he says, "How many bubbles are in a bar of soap?" Her uncle's lips go tight as he recalls being asked to name all 67 judges in the state of Alabama and being turned away when he failed to answer such questions. As Lillian pushes on, struggling to keep her balance, she sees a brave girl standing next to her mother and father as they register to vote. The year is 1920, and the 19th Amendment has just been passed, and a law that allows women to vote. The girl is Lillian herself, with her mama and papa. They are being chased away by an angry mob. There's Mr. Bentley, the barber, and Mr. McCroy, who owns the ice cream shop. She feels the firm grip of her mother's hand as they run through the streets back home. And though today the birds are singing and people are smiling, Lillian sees in vivid orange and brilliant red the cross burning on the lawn of her girlhood home, set aflame by the same angry mob just because her parents wanted to vote. This is something that she will always see. Lillian stops in her tracks, unable to keep going. As she stands there, she sees herself trying to register to vote for the first time. She sees a blank piece of paper on which she must write down a section of the U.S. Constitution, word for word, as it is being mumbled by the registrar, a test she could not pass. No one could. "Are you going to vote?" she asks a young man who passes her on her route. "Yes, ma'am," he answers. "You better," she says, and she means it. For Lillian sees the funeral procession for a man named Jimmy Lee Jackson, a 26-year-old shot by a policeman over nothing more than taking part in a peaceful protest. It's March 1965, and all he wanted was justice and the right to vote. Looking up at the top of the hill, Lillian wonders how she'll ever make it. It looks so far, and she's so tired. Though her feet and legs ache with 100 years of walking, what fuels her ancient body is seeing those 600 people beginning a peaceful protest march from Selma to Montgomery. People who, though they don't know it yet, will be stopped on a bridge in Selma by a policeman with clubs. All they want is justice and the right to vote. At the front is future Congressman John Lewis, whose forehead will always bear the scar from where he was beaten. As long as Lillian still has a pulse, she is going to vote. So she keeps on climbing, keeps on seeing, this time the second march from Selma. This march also ends on the bridge in a prayer led by the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., whose dreams of justice for African Americans are already famous. Wherever he went, he lifted people up with his words, and his words still lift up Lillian, who, seeing the top of the hill, is not about to stop. Footstep by footstep, she keeps going. Just as the marcher from Selma to Montgomery keep going through the cold and rain, finally making it all the way to Montgomery on their third march, she sees them all, Martin Luther King, John Lewis, rabbis, priests, and 2,500 others. 25,000 others. Lillian is there. She can still hear Reverend King asking how long they would have to wait for justice. She can still feel the power of his voice when he says, "Not long." And as she takes those final steps to the top of the hill, Lillian can still see how Reverend King was right, for she can hear the voice of President Lyndon Johnson on her TV saying to America, "Every American citizen must have an equal right to vote. There is no duty which weighs more heavily on us than the duty we have to ensure that right. All of us must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice, and we shall overcome." Before Lillian walks through the doors of the building, where you better believe she will vote, she looks up and sees the same blue sky, brighter than any sky she's ever seen, that she saw on August 6th of 1965. That was the day that President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act, the one law protecting all Americans' right to vote in every state and every town, the one law protecting Lillian as a full-fledged citizen of the United States. She enters the building, and as Lillian steps into the voting booth, once again she sees herself stepping into the voting booth in 1965 for the very first time, and she knows full well she would not be standing here today if it were not for the people who marched, and the people who died for her right to vote. Lillian touches her finger to the lever, and because she's a citizen of the United States of America, protected by the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Lillian pushes that lever. Lillian votes. Here's the author's note talking about Lillian and her history in the Voting Rights Act. Unfortunately, as it says in this book, in 2013, the Supreme Court struck down a key part of the Voting Rights Act, which means that some states have created things like voter ID laws, which require citizens to present a state-issued photo ID, which is difficult for poor people and elderly people to get. We've also seen a lot of states shut down a lot of voting centers in places where more poor people and people who have trouble getting onto public transportation would usually vote, which means that they have to stand in really long lines in order to vote. It's super sad because, as we know, voting and voting fairly and accurately is a super important part of our government. It's how we pick the people that run our government and how we decide what we want our government to be like. Hopefully, sometime soon in the future, we'll see those voting rights be fixed so that everyone has the right to vote, just like Lillian. Once again, my name is Sarah Mari. I'm one of the librarians at Portland Public Library in Portland, Maine. Thank you for listening, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye.